Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Boy, this is interesting turnout here. I see some old faces in the crowd here, supporting one of their former classmates. Anyways, today our conference, as sometimes occurs, is a master's thesis defense, and most of you in the room know Julian Lipscombe, who's been with us for a while and now appears to be reaching the end of his OHSU Informatics journey. As you can see, he's all dressed up because he's got a real job now, which I guess I don't. Anyways, I remember first getting email from Julian probably about 3 years ago. He had been looking at the UC Davis program, and they were undergoing some troubles, and so he ended up enrolling here. And then I remember I was attending a conference in Sheffield, England, in like July before he started, and so I had the opportunity to meet him then. And then, of course, he joined us. He actually came to us with quite a bit of experience, master's in information systems from Sheffield University. Is that technically how they, or University of Sheffield, which actually I'm going back to this summer because there's an informatics meeting there in July that they asked me to be the keynote speaker. Anyways, he was a very good student and never hesitated to fill us in on his opinions on things, which we actually did appreciate. And now he's ready to defend his master's thesis. Let me actually acknowledge one other person in the room, Dr. Lynn Flowers, who's one of our distant students who, as I always say to the distant students, if you're ever in Portland, drop on by, and that's exactly what he's done. And actually with him I said, there's this cool new thing you could do called the tram, so he rode the tram up the hill. Yeah. So anyways, so as you know, the way that we handle master's thesis defenses is that the candidate, the defender, whatever it's called, gives his talk, and then it's open to the general floor for discussion, and then everyone except the examination committee leaves the room, and then they ask him any additional questions, and then he leaves the room, and then they decide whether or not he has met the criteria for passing. And many of you in the room have been through this. So anyways, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julian.
Thank you. Is that okay? Can everybody hear me? Right. Well, thanks, Bill. Surprisingly enough, the tram isn't the highlight of my trip because I don't like those sort of suspended things, so I think I'll probably give that one a miss. As Bill mentioned, I was a full-time student here for a couple of years. I left in August and went back to my native land. So now I don't speak funny anymore, I just speak normally. So this is my oral thesis defense. My study was... This is actually my short title of my project, would you believe? I think the actual thesis is a bit longer, but it was a study looking at people with visual impairment in Oregon and where they went to retrieve and receive health information. And there's a subplot here, and I also looked at internet and non-internet users within rural and suburban urban areas of Oregon. With that, this is the outline of my presentation. My rather grandiose main aims of study, which quickly hit the dust, but I'll put them down here anyway. Background into areas of previous research into the area. Following the background of my main aims, I ended up with a series of research questions. So I've listed them there, then go into the methodology, results, then discussion and conclusions, any potential future research that may come out of my rather small study, and finally even though it may be the most important thing, the acknowledgements at the end, especially considering what's going to happen after my presentation. The acknowledgements are definitely the most important thing. So these were, before I started the study, these were my main aims of the project. They're kind of rather broad and general in nature, where and how people with visual impairment in Oregon currently retrieve and receive their health information. What are the experiences of people with visual impairment when they search for health information on the internet? And what barriers and obstacles were people with visual impairment experiencing when accessing health information, or even just using computers? Now we go into a bit of a section looking at the background of the study, kind of previous research into the areas. The Pew Internet group had done a series of studies looking at people's activities on the internet and the increasing use of the internet to search for various bits of information. In 2005, they did a report which said that 79% of internet users had searched for information on at least one major health topic, which equates to around 95 million American adults, which is a really large number when you consider that I don't think there's that many people in the whole of the UK. But only 59% of American adults also reported that they had internet access. One of the previous reports that they carried out 2 years previously suggested that online health seekers were mainly motivated to search for health information that relates to actions that they might need to take to address specific health concerns. So it's very much an individual thing when and if they... Are you okay, Ken? Can you hear? Okay. Maybe it's my microphone being hidden. Hopefully, is that better? Okay. Maybe it's just my accent you're having trouble with. According to Andrew, it's gone back to my English state it was previous to coming here. So yeah, basically what the Pew report suggested was that people have individual concerns, and when and if they need to address that, then they'll search for health information at that point. The report found the most common health topics of online searches were information about a specific disease or a medical problem, which is probably not surprising, and also a certain treatment or procedure. But the next two categories are kind of more categories that seem to be happening more and more recently, kind of people researching diet and nutrition and worrying about exercise and fitness. Before I could embark on the study, I wanted to get a grasp of how many people actually in the US actually had visual impairment or some form of disability. The US Census of 2000 reported that there was 49.7 million within the United States who had some sort of long-lasting condition or disability. And 3.6% of the total population, or 9.3 million people, were reported as having some sort of sensory disability, either a sight or a hearing impairment. A report by the National Eye Institute in 2002 documented the prevalence of visual impairment and blindness within the US for just those aged 40 and over, and they found that there was nearly 3.5 million people suffering from vision impairment, which was an overall national average of 2.85. This report actually went state by state, and they found that in Oregon there was nearly 45,000 people, which was 2.94% of the population who were suffering from some form of visual impairment. Our good friends at Pew, they'd also done a report looking at the distribution of internet users in the United States during 2003, and found that people with disabilities were less connected to the internet than other groups of Americans. A drop of like 20%, with 38% of people with disabilities reporting using the internet compared to 58% of the sample. And a fifth of these people actually stated that a disability made use of the internet difficult. of those people who said that they didn't use the internet, 28% said that their disability impaired or made impossible the use of the internet. A report by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration differentiated people with visual impairment from the rest of people with other disabilities. And they compared their uptake of internet use with age group controls and found that for those people aged under 25, it was very similar in terms of people percentage using the internet. But as the people got older, the disparity widened. But there was also a similar overall frequency of actually using the internet to search for health information. The American Foundation for the Blind estimated in 1999 estimated the number of people with visual impairment who were actually using computers, and they estimated that it was 1.5 million people in 1999, and the number of people who had visual impairment who were aged 15 and older who regularly used a computer was nearly 1 million people. With regard to the accessibility of the internet for people with disabilities, there are some initiatives and governance already in place. One organisation with guidelines on accessibility is the Web Accessibility Initiative, the Worldwide Web Consortium, or W3C. But these guidelines aren't well known and are not generally conformed to. You move on to a federal bill, which is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which deals with accessibility of computing technology. But that only actually applies to companies who have governmental contracts or federal agencies, and this isn't regularly enforced either. However, the American Foundation for the Blind did report that more organisations are asking designers to make their sites more accessible to people with some form of disability, but this was less social responsibility or concern and more financial concerns. They found that people online stores had a great deal to gain from people who prefer shopping online rather than a store, which is just a general phenomenon and probably unlikely to be specifically to do with people with disabilities. The other part of my study is I wanted to see if there was any variation between the internet use of people within geographical areas, and the Pew Project also did a report in 2003 which compared internet use between geographical areas and found that people living in rural areas were less likely to use the internet. This was consistent with a previous study done by the same authors in 2000. They suggested that the variants were driven by low-income rural individuals, the fact that rural people tended to be older and had lower levels of educational attainment. But there seemed to be little variation in searching for health information for those people who actually use the internet. The final part of background is there have been very few studies specifically looking at people with visual impairment and searching for health information. But rather than kind of listing them all out for you, there was a report done by Beverly et al., who are actually at Sheffield University, or University of Sheffield, I should say correctly, who did a systematic review of the existing literature and found that few studies actually examined the unique health information needs of people with visual impairment. Instead, they were more interested in establishing a healthy lifestyle or health promotion as the basis of their study. The authors argued that three general hypotheses were being used. People with visual impairment had the same wide range of health information needs as the general population. People with visual impairment were disadvantaged, and people with visual impairment simply required the same health information, but in alternate formats. In the conclusion, I'll address whether my study actually supported these three hypotheses or not. But they also suggested that the fourth hypothesis needs to be created, which assumes that people with visual impairment have unique health information needs and requirements. So following the background and looking into the research, previous research, I arrived at 4 specific research questions that I wanted answering from my study. And in the discussion, I'll see whether I actually found answers to these specific questions or not. Where do people with visual impairment go to satisfy their health information needs and requirements? What barriers or obstacles exist that prohibits or stops these people with visual impairment from using online health information resources? Are there variations in the health information seeking patterns of people with visual impairment in rural areas compared to suburban urban areas? And what suggestions or improvements would people with visual impairments like to see with relation to health information resources, both online and off? However, creating a set of research questions was the easy part. The next step was actually finding volunteers to take part in my study. With help from the Oregon Commission for the Blind offices both in Portland and in Coos Bay, which is about 250 miles south-west on the coast, as Bay would indicate, I managed to locate 28 willing volunteers who agreed to take part in the study. The study was a series of questions in a semi-structured interview, subdivided into sections. There were different interview schedules for people with different levels of computer literacy. A couple of the sections were specifically asking about their experiences of searching for health information online, and obviously if they'd never used computers before, then those questions there was no point in asking them. And so we ended up with a distribution as shown on this slide. I actually managed to get 14 people in rural areas and 14 in suburban urban areas, but the people were very much skewed to having some form of computer literacy. To determine the levels of computer literacy, I used the definitions based on a report by the American Library Association, and these are kind of pretty broad categories. So people that were considered to be non-computer literate, you can see here, no knowledge of basic computer functions, didn't know how to open web browsers or use email. The baseline, level 1, was how to open and close web browsers, open a URL, etc., and how to use bookmarks. And the advanced levels were know the differences between various internet browsers and their different versions, and be aware of the potential security and privacy threats when using the internet. For the purposes of my study, I separated my sample into level 0s as being non-computer literate, and level 1 and 2 as actually being computer literate. To determine geographical areas, Oregon counties have been rated as rural or suburban urban based on a Department of Agriculture definitions of whether they're rural or urban, and which meant that volunteers who lived in these various counties were accordingly allocated whether they were rural or suburban urban. The semi-structured interviews used in the study, as I mentioned before, were split into a number of sections, and the sections asked of each grouping is shown here on this slide. The first 3 sections, demographic information, visual acuity background, and current health information seeking practices, were actually the same questions, so they were asked of all of the individuals. The only separate sections are the bottom ones, where the non-computer literate or the level 0 computer literacy respondents were asked about their computer and technological usage, whereas the level 1 and level 2 computer literacy had questions on internet, computer, and other technology use, and their previous experience of health information retrieval using the internet. So now we go on to the results section. Due to time restraints, obviously I won't present all of the results of all of the questions within my study, but a select few which hopefully can contribute to answering some of the research questions. This slide basically shows the demographic info of all of the 28 respondents. So 14 and 14 for male and female, the average age, whether they were married or single or divorced, and the highest level of educational attainment. as they're just figures from the study, then you can see that here there seems to be a trend towards the people in suburban urban areas having a higher level of educational attainment to those with those in rural areas, with 9 of the 14 suburban urban respondents having completed at least one college degree, whereas there's only 1 in the rural areas. The next section describes the levels of visual acuity that the patients were suffering from. The most common the most common form of visual impairment was total blindness, which is obviously separate from people who are legally blind, because people with legally blind still have some sight, but just not. And then they're classified within. They're classified as being just legally blind as opposed to being totally blind. The second part of this slide indicates when they develop their visual impairment. So quite a number of the respondents develop their visual impairment within their first year. So obviously they've never been able to read print, whereas some of the people who develop their visual impairment at a later age actually were able to read print before they develop their visual impairment, which the final category, aged over 16 and gradually, some of the respondents indicated that their visual impairment was gradually deteriorated throughout life, and there wasn't a one set date where they could remember that they started suffering from their problems. Some of the questions that were asked of the entire sample was how they currently sought health information. This wasn't specifically to do with whether they searched on the internet, just I was trying to get a gauge of their how they search for health information at the moment and who the resources they use to get that information. The most common 2 categories, as you can see here, were people using either the internet or using computers to find information, or just talking to doctors or other health professionals to get that information. The second question here is who they would actually ask questions regarding health information. Maybe unsurprisingly, the majority said that they were looking for, they talked to doctors and physicians, and then friends and family, and then other health professionals. They tended to be more specialists in certain areas, so if they had specific ailments or specific questions, they may ask a specific health professional who could answer the question. What I did find, there seemed to be a trend, a difference between suburban urban respondents and rural respondents in the methods that are used, with people in suburban urban areas being consistently using the internet and computer, compared to people in rural areas who tended more to talk to their doctor or health professional as their main method. This slide outlines the type of health information that the respondents most recently sought, and the methods that they employed to retrieve this information. So this is slightly different from the previous slide, as this is their most recent search as opposed to just how they generally searched. There was a wide variety of answers about the type of information they saw, but the most common answer was that they were searching for specific information on a disease or an ailment. The methods that they sought, this seemed to be very similar to the previous response, with the suburban urban respondents tending to use the internet or computers to find their information, and the rural people using the internet and computers as well, but also talking to a doctor or a physician. All respondents were asked to report on any barriers or problems they had encountered when retrieving health information. There was a wide variety of answers here, but their most common response was that they were frustrated by the use of printed material. This seemed to be more common amongst suburban urban respondents. Amongst rural respondents, it seemed to be having problems with health professionals, and there were a few kind of worrying comments within this grouping where one respondent stated that they didn't seem to be being taken seriously all the time, and another respondent who actually stated that all the health professionals were condescending to them. The other internet issues category here includes problems of accessing the internet at home and knowing what words to use in a computer search. Respondents were then asked whether they thought that their visual impairment actually hindered them when getting health information. Found here that half of the respondents actually said that they didn't think it was actually hindering them. Following that question, they were for the people who stated that they did think it was hindering, in what respect, and in what ways did they think their visual impairment actually hindered them. And communication respect with health professionals seemed to be common here as well. I guess these are the same people who commented on the previous question about the fact that they were having problems with health professionals. Okay. The next section for the computer literate respondents, I was trying to find out what sort of internet, computer, and technology usage they used, whether they had all the technology available at home. So, rather unsurprisingly, the vast majority did say that they had a computer at home, and also that they had internet connection at home. The next series of questions, I was trying to find out whether they needed some specific devices in order for them to actually use the computers and the internet. And again, the vast majority stated that they did use specific devices to enable them to use the internet and computers. The final part of this slide indicates that the names of the devices that they most commonly used. The first two options, JAWS for Windows and Windows Eyes, are both screen reader software. Then the next option is a screen magnifier and zoom text. Zoom text is I think is a screen magnifier, isn't it? So the majority kind of either used screen reader or screen magnifier in order to allow them to use the internet. The final section actually of the study actually was looked at the specific health information retrieval patterns and experiences of the people using the internet. This was a section only answered by the computer literate group as well. Nearly 80% of the computer literate group actually stated that they had used the internet to actually search for health information at least once. There seemed to be a trend amongst the suburban, urban, and the rural participants where all of the suburban, urban respondents actually stated that they had used the internet at least once to search for health information, whereas it was almost 50-50 amongst the rural patients. Following this question, there was two sub-questions asking for those people who didn't use it regularly, so those in the categories of no and once and not recently, to indicate why they hadn't used the internet to search for health information when they used it for other things. And four of them actually stated that they'd never actually considered it, or they prefer to use to just talk to doctors. The final question on this slide is talks about ask them whether they would potentially ask somebody else to search for health information for them on the internet if they didn't search for them themselves, and if so, who they would ask. This question was asked to see whether it was just their lack of trust with the health information on the internet, as opposed to just practicalities to see why they hadn't searched for health information on the internet. But all of the respondents stated that they would potentially ask somebody else to find health information for them. So it obviously wasn't a trust thing, it was just a practicality. This slide shows the health information topics that were most commonly searched for and the frequency that the respondents searching for health information, how frequently they actually use the internet to search for health information. Once again, the most common answer was that they searched for information on a disease or an ailment, but there was also pharmacy information, drug information, etc. The question regarding how frequently they searched for health information in turn, it seems that the majority actually search for health information at least monthly, and in some cases even more frequently than that, fortnightly. This slide reports on the barriers the respondents faced and reported when accessing information for the internet, and the methods that they used in order to overcome these problems. One of the major problems was that screen readers have problems sometimes with photographs and graphics and certain types of files which are sometimes recorded on the internet. The screen reader has trouble reading those, which under the broad category of inaccessible sites, the screen reader having problems just accessing all of the information that's on a specific website. Their major methods of overcoming these problems seem to be kind of almost sidestepping the problem, just going to an accessible site. So that may take 3 or 4 sites before they find one that's more accessible for their screen reader, or they would call somebody else to help them. This might be just somebody coming over and actually reading the information off the site for them, or calling somebody and then actually pointing them in the direction of a more accessible website. This probably isn't much of a surprise to anybody living in the 21st century, but it shows the methods employed by the people with visual impairment to retrieve and search for health information from the internet, and the sorts of websites that they visited. As the vast majority used Google at some point to just type in search parameters within Google and then go to the sites from there. Or they may have used another search engine that tended to be MSN. But less people actually went specifically to a major health information website, I guess we call WebMD. We'd probably go to NHS Net in the UK, but WebMD seems to be the well-known health website here in the States. There were very many websites noted by the specific individuals, which kind of makes the second part quite difficult to describe in terms of the data that we received. The specific sites were, if they just listed, they may have got a specific ailment and they went directly to a site that was related to that site. So if they were suffering from a carcinoma, they may have gone to a specific site directly. Otherwise, they may have just used a link off Google, health insurance website, once again, kind of specific websites like WebMD, Medline, or the Mayo Clinic. There was actually one of the problems of asking this question is that they may have searched like 3 or 4 months ago, and 3 respondents actually couldn't remember the names of the websites that they'd actually visited on their last health information search. The respondents were then asked to give their impression of the sites they visited and an impression of how satisfied they were with the standard of information that they received. As a whole, the impression that they found was generally quite positive. Obviously, there was a couple of people there that found that they couldn't actually find the specific information that they were searching for. With the satisfaction question, this was obviously a very subjective answer. There wasn't a Likert scale or anything. I just asked them how satisfied they were with the information that they retrieved. So the majority once again seemed to be reasonably satisfied with the information they got. I've highlighted that there seems to be a variation between pretty and quite satisfied within suburban areas and people who are very satisfied in rural areas, but once again, this is purely subjective. This slide shows the length of time on average the respondents spent when searching online for health information and how they would rate their experiences of searching online. So there's not a whole lot of interesting information here or relevant information, but you can tell that they don't spend that much time searching for information, maybe under an hour, which I would have, it's possible is pretty similar to how anybody else would. I guess it really depends on how quickly they find the information that they're looking for. The second part here talks about how they would, what was their experience when searching for health information online. And here, even though there were quite a few positive remarks, there was also quite a few negative ones as well, much more than when they rated their satisfaction, where a few people suggested that it was just too much effort, it was either frustrating. It was frustrating for them, and that they had sometimes had problems with the screen reader, which probably goes back to the problems with inaccessible sites. The respondents were then asked whether they thought their visual impairment actually hindered them when searching for health information online, and if so, in what ways. Once again, there seems to be a trend between suburban urban respondents and rural respondents, although the numbers here are pretty small, where the suburban urban respondents seem to have some, they suggested that their visual impairment, if not always hindering them, sometimes, or yes, it actually did hinder them, whereas there was a slightly bigger percentage within the rural respondents. So once again, it's kind of the numbers are too small really to draw too much of a conclusion from that. The ways in which they were being hindered, once again, we go back to the inaccessible sites problem. Again, that seemed to be the major issue. This slide reports on the suggestions and recommendations that respondents would make to enable them to use the internet to search for health information easier. Once again, we're back to the same problems of screen reader problems, not being able to read photographs, making websites more accessible. There are a wide variety of answers here. That's why the others category is so large. All of the computer literate respondents were then asked whether they thought being able to access health information online provided greater benefit for people with visual impairment, and if so, in what ways they thought that it would. The vast majority stated that they thought that it would provide greater benefit, and the major reason seemed to be that they could get instant access to health information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it would also allow them to access the information in a non-printed form, which was one of their major gripes. But it also, one of the interesting things was that it would allow them, they thought it would allow them more freedom and independence. This slide reports on whether the respondents thought the health information on the internet was trustworthy and accurate. Obviously, this is another purely subjective response to this question. The majority of the top, or the most frequent answers here stated that it all depended on the specific site and source of the information. The first three answers here are all to do with site-related and how trustworthy they thought the site was rather than the information. The four bottom variables here, negative responses were comments by the individuals that were negative about the trustworthiness of the system. So they may have just said, well, they didn't think that the internet was as trusting as going to the doctors. The questioning responses were comments where they were questioning where the information was coming from before they could determine whether it was trustworthy and accurate. Comparable responses were comments by individuals stating they thought the internet was comparable to other sources. And the rating responses that some actual people stated, well, they thought it was like 75% accurate or 75 to 80% accurate. The final question they were actually asked was whether whether they thought that they were getting comparable health information to those people who do not have visual impairment. And here there is a slightly less positive than before, but most of the individuals actually thought that they were getting comparable information. 17 people saying yes, 5 people saying no, and then 2 who were kind of sitting on the fence a bit. The reasons for those people who didn't say that they were receiving comparable information, what were the causes? And the main reason was a physical reason. It was that they just couldn't go to a library and browse books. It just took longer for them to get comparable information to normally sighted people. Right. So now I'll return back to my research questions I stated at the start of the project. And the first research question was, where do people with visual impairment in Oregon go to satisfy their health information needs and requirements? And kind of probably unsurprisingly, they talk to a doctor or a health professional, or they use the computer or the internet. But also they sometimes talk to family, friends, or someone else who had a knowledge of their specific ailment or disease that they were looking for. There seemed to be a trend towards suburban urban respondents using a computer and internet, and rural respondents talking to a doctor or a health professional. They would primarily ask doctors or physicians questions regarding health information, but conversely, they seem to more commonly trust friends and family to ask health information, although doctors and physicians also were rated pretty highly there as well. The second research question, what barriers or obstacles exist that prohibits or stops those people with visual impairment from using online health information resources? Here I've separated them by their specific groupings. So the non-computer literate group stated that it was due to a lack of knowledge and experience of using computers and the internet, or issues to do with security, or they would prefer to use other methods. For those computer literate group respondents who had not used the internet to search for health information, they mainly said that they'd just not considered or simply not got round to using the internet for that purpose. For the computer literate people who had used the internet, there were problems with inaccessibility of some websites. There's also poor methods of labeling and navigation on those websites, which led to frustration and problems for people using screen readers, enabling them to access the information on these websites. The third research question were there variations in the health information seeking patterns of people with visual impairment in rural areas compared to suburban urban areas? Once again, these trends that seem to be that their suburban urban respondents were more likely to use computer internet to search for this information, and rural respondents talking to a doctor or health professional. The most common barrier seemed to be use and distribution of printed material for suburban urban respondents, and problems with condescending health professionals for rural respondents. Their rural respondents seemed to be more confident that their visual impairment did not hinder them, and were also seemed to be more likely to be satisfied with the health information that they received. Whereas all suburban urban respondents stated that they used the internet at least once to search for health information. These are the computer literate groupings, whereas only just over half of the rural respondents stated this. My final research question was, what suggestions or improvements would people with visual impairments like to see with relation to health information resources? The respondents stated that the accessibility of websites could be improved. Also, they would like the lessen of sophistication of websites by lessening the amount of non-labeled photographs, pictures and videos, the reduction of use of PDF files, which seems to be a particular problem with some of the screen readers, and the creation of health information websites that were specific to the needs of the visually impaired. As my study is pretty small, then some of these comparisons have to be treated with a pinch of salt, obviously. When you're comparing a study of 28 respondents, then I can create a percentage, but obviously when you're comparing that with a Pew report that's looking at maybe thousands, tens of thousands of people, then there's a potential for skewed figures, especially when you consider that there's a potential bias of the actual respondents within my study, because as the study was a volunteers-only study, then presumably the people at the Oregon Commission for the Blind suggested people that would be more willing to take part in the study or more likely to take part in the study, and hence, with the people of the Oregon Commission for the Blind knowing what my study was looking for, they might push forward people who have a specific interest in the same areas as my study. So having said that as my major caveats, I'm still going to plunge straight into comparing my study with previous research. So the Pew report stated that 79% of internet users search for health information, whereas the National Telecommunications and Information Administration suggested that only 39% of visually impaired use the internet for searching for health information, whereas I found that 79% of my respondents did. Another Pew report stated that 38% of disabled people access the internet, whereas 86% of my respondents with visual impairment stated this. So in addition to the caveat about being a potential bias of my volunteers, there's also the fact that we're not really comparing like with like here, because the 38% of people is all disabled people as opposed to all people with a disability, as opposed to my sample, which was just specifically looking at people with visual impairment. The most common topic, information about disease and ailment, was the same as found in the Pew report. However, the next three common topics in the Pew report to do with exercise and nutrition weren't actually repeated within my study. There was 2 research studies by Berry and Davis that suggested that people with visual impairment, that one of the problems was increasing access to accessible information and also problems of inaccessible websites, and my study kind of supported these findings. And it also supported 2 of the 3 hypotheses of Beverly et al. The only hypothesis they didn't really support was that the people with vision impairment were disadvantaged. I didn't really find that, and the people I interviewed didn't give any impression or that they felt they were disadvantaged. So I think it may be a question of people with normal sight assuming that they know what the problems are of people with vision impairment. I found that the variation between geographical areas was pretty much the same as the Pew report into rural versus suburban areas. So, after all of my discussion and results, these are the conclusions that I came up with. The respondents seem to embrace the new technologies and also the opportunities for seeking information in an accessible form that the internet provides. They seem to envisage the internet as a tool that will empower them and give them more independence and freedom, which must be a good thing. However, some respondents felt disenfranchised by their experiences with the medical profession, and they did not feel that they were getting comparable health information to other groupings in society. They tended to be frustrated with the amount of written and printed health information that was given to them, but their main barrier and obstacle seemed to be inaccessible websites. One solution possibly would be to enforce governance on website accessibility, but that's probably pie in the sky. It'll be trying to force some sort of legislation on the internet, which isn't going to happen in the near future. This is a slide on potential future research. I've performed kind of some standard statistical analysis. I didn't find anything statistically significant amongst the demographic information, and obviously with the information that we're retrieving, there can be many different avenues of searching for additional statistical analysis on the study. one of the caveats that I should mention within the results is that most of the questions, a number of questions, could have had multiple answers or open-ended answers. So for the purpose of my study, I actually grouped specific topics, consistent topics together. The future research obviously replicating the study on a wider scale and also with a larger sample to determine whether the consistency of results that I found were the same in a bigger population. And also attempting to replicate the results on a randomly selected group of people with visual impairment. Once again, this is going back to the potential bias of the people that were actually volunteered within the study. Because I thought that there was a potential bias towards more technologically aware recipients, just simply from the volunteers suggested by the people at the Oregon Commission for the Blind. So that's pretty much it. I have a series of acknowledgements. Richard Appleyard is my thesis advisor, and Holly Jimison here at OHSU, and also unfortunately Winslow Parker couldn't actually make it today, but he's the adaptive technology specialist down in the Portland branch of the Oregon Commission for the Blind, and he helped me a lot in kind of setting up the project and also locating volunteers within the Portland area and also in Eugene. The other acknowledgement, Jan Hearing, who works down in the Oregon Commission for the Blind in Coos Bay, she was somebody who was very important within the study to get all the rural recipients. I found it very difficult at the start of the study to find any people that I could find within rural areas to actually take part in the study. But fortunately, I got in contact with Jan Hearing, and she managed to round up an equivalent number of rural volunteers for me. And obviously, the volunteers and the participants who actually took part in the study. I'm sure it wasn't particularly fun for them to have some English guy turning up, coming to their house and then asking them questions for 45 minutes, sticking a tape recorder in their face. So obviously I'm very grateful for those people, and hopefully the information that they volunteered can be useful in some way to helping them in the future. So these are I've got 2 pages of references, and that's it for my presentation. So thank you, and if you have any further questions, I guess. Yes, Adam. Can you press your student mic, apparently?
So on one of your slides, you talked about tailoring sites to the needs of people who are visually impaired.
Yeah.
And does that mean, taking the existing content and making it more accessible, or creating, different kinds of content? And if so, what would that content look like?
Well, pretty much the 2 things that you just suggested are probably work hand in hand together. If you make the content of a website more accessible, then and also in a format that makes it accessible for the screen readers, then you've got around the problem of making the site almost tailored towards that sort of visual impairment. Obviously, the legislation at the moment doesn't cater specifically for people with visual impairment anyway. It's kind of for any people with disabilities. So, yeah. So, I mean, some of the accessibility problems are due to screen reader problems. So that, obviously, they're going to be software that may be used more frequently by people with visual impairment as opposed to other groupings.
I guess the other part of the question was that, you sort of presented the 4th hypothesis early, that maybe visually impaired people needed different content. It sounds like what you found is that they actually could use the same content, but it just had to be more accessible. Yeah,
judging from the topics that they were searching for, the major topics seem to be the same sort of information. And I mean, if you think of it intuitively, you probably that's the conclusion that you would reach, is that they would actually search the types of health information that they were looking for beyond maybe research into specific eye problems that they may encounter, or looking for health insurance or something that may uniquely affect them. Then the rest of the potential health issues that they may search for are going to be similar you would have thought with the general population. I don't know your name, so.
You measured when they were, or you collected information about when they were visually impaired. Did that have any bearing on any of the answers?
To be honest, I haven't actually looked into that area at all as of yet, but I mean that could be something that I could do for, within the final report, as it were. Yes.
Your data showed a differential of the rural respondents to your urban, suburban respondents, despite the fact that they had, as you showed, equal access to the internet and, and computers. I'm curious if you saw any anecdotal information with regard to the relationship to their health professionals, given that that was their alternate source to get information.
Well, I mean, they seem to use doctors and health professionals more in order to get the health information, but they also reported problems that they'd encountered when trying to retrieve that information. There seemed to be a consistency, or maybe not a consistency, but a reporting of health professionals being condescending or kind of not treating them seriously for problems. So even with those barriers that they'd encountered, they still seem to be using that method to retrieve their health information rather than using the internet. So you would have thought there may have been if they are encountering those problems, that they may try a different methodology to retrieve that health information, but I didn't actually see that within my research.
I have a suggestion and a question. Suggestion first. Maybe you could use charts and graphs instead of tables, because it's hard for me to read patterns from your numbers, from your tables. So the graphs, I think, would be more visually appealing.
Mm-hmm. That's fine. That's true.
And the question, I'm not sure if I have followed the methodology that you have used to arrive at your conclusions. Could you elaborate on that?
What do you mean by
methodology? How did you do some statistical analysis? Or?
Oh, okay. The actual questionnaire was a series of, as I mentioned initially, there's a series of different sections. In each section there were specific questions. Some of them required a yes/no answer, and some of them were just general questions that the respondent could answer in any way that they wanted to. And so sometimes you got multiple answers. If, for example, if they used one of the questions would, do you think that being able to access health information online provides potentially greater benefit for people with visual impairment? So that would be a yes or no answer to start with, but then they could elaborate and then give multiple answers why they thought that it would provide potentially greater benefit. So what I did then was take the responses that they gave and then allocated kind of groupings. So if there was consistent findings, they may have commented in a slightly different manner, but you could say, well, I use a computer or something like that, and I use search on Google, and then some other individual might say, well, I use the internet. So you can group those together as people who use the internet or whatever to answer that. So obviously with a statistical analysis, it's going to be slightly problematic to because of the fact that I'm actually physically grouping them myself, rather than otherwise we'll have multiple different comments from multiple different individuals. But with some of the basic demographic information, then you can do the statistical analysis on that because of the fact that you've got finite answers, as it were. So I don't know if that that explains it or not. Yes, Ken.
I notice your total sample is 28, and in the results it drops down to 24 sometimes. I see that's excluding the 4 people.
Yeah, there was 4 people that were considered to be non-computer literate. So
then a bunch of them are 18. Who is that excluding?
Okay, so, sorry, I should have explained this. We started off with 28 patients. 4 were considered to be non-computer literate, so they answered different sections, hence why the N equals 24. At the start of the final section, which asked them whether they'd search for health information online, there were a number of questions that were only asked of people who had searched for health information online. Obviously, The people that were excluded were the people that suggested that, who said that they hadn't searched for help information online. So obviously the questions relating to their experiences in that area, they were excluded from. But they answered a subset of questions which asked them why they didn't use the internet to search for help information, whereas they used the internet regularly for other. So they were in a subgroup, as it were. That's why the ends fluctuate. Any other questions?
So we'll leave you to your committee.
Okay.
And
well, thank you for the time. And this section due to